Yo, what's happening, people? Okay, so I want to talk about First Kill, and I tried a really cool intro right there. I'm not sure how that looked on camera, but I guess we'll find out. I want to talk about First Kill, which is a show on Netflix that came out, I think, a few months ago. It's pretty recent-ish. Um, and I watched it, well, I just watched it like I think over the last maybe week-ish or so. But it came out maybe a few months ago, this year sometime. And I want to talk about it because, I'm apparently watching a lot of shows now that I want to talk about. And this ain't a review like some of the other videos I've done like this. It's not a review. It's really just an opinion dump. I've watched something, I have some thoughts in it, and I'd like to share some of those thoughts. I'm going to try and avoid getting into some of the major spoilers, but yeah, I'm probably going to say some stuff that, I don't know, maybe you don't want to hear if you haven't watched it, and that kind of thing, just so you want, just so you want. But this was a pretty cool show, though. I quite enjoyed it. Mostly, it's 8 episodes. It's about 40-ish minutes per episode, 40 to 50 minutes per episode. It is about vampires. There's some other monsters in there as well, but it's mostly about vampires and a vampire hunter or vampire hunters rather. And I guess it's almost like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but let me say this: it's like Buffy the Vampire Slayer meets Romeo and Juliet. Even though I guess Buffy the Vampire Slayer, to be fair, had its elements of Romeo and Juliet in there as well. But it's a bit maybe more so because rather than being, one vampire hunter, there's loads of vampire hunters. There's pretty much a whole clan of vampire hunters, and then you have clans of vampires and two main families. You got one family of hunters, one family of vampires. It is almost like the was it in Romeo and Juliet? Was it the Capulets and the other ones? The Romeo's family and Juliet's family. It's kind of almost kind of like that. In fact, one of the characters is actually called Juliet, and they do reference they do mention Romeo and Juliet in this series as well. So I'm pretty sure they're aware of what they're doing with that, Romeo and Juliet and vampire with vampires and vampire hunters. But yeah, well, it was pretty cool throughout. I liked what they did. They kind of had their own take on vampire lore, while still taking some things from pre-established vampire lore already. But it had this whole thing about sort of legacy vampires and non-legacy vampires and the sort of differences between them. And they had that as well. So they have a pretty good reason as to why some vampires can maybe walk during the daylight, and they have this whole thing about certain monsters. The most dangerous monsters are the ones that look like humans, and that's kind of like a theme throughout the series. But what was interesting is look, a few things that interest me. Another thing that was interesting is that they set it in this world where people know monsters exist. People know vampires and werewolves and zombies and all that. They know they exist, but it's been such a long time since the last monster sighting that nobody's really looking for them anymore. And there's even people who've grown up have never seen one, or at least they don't believe they have because they don't know something, right? So it's kind of like that. So when it does happen, you have these sort of different ways of dealing with it. And they even have like the mom group, that kind of protests about this whole thing, which makes so much sense. And this is actually something that they didn't do in Buffy. Well, they did, but only for one episode. But I was kind of thinking that makes sense. Like, I mean, yes, I get it. They could be annoying because they end up causing more troubles than they actually solve, and they get in the way of the people that are trying to do certain things. But it makes sense in the worlds that why wouldn't a group kind of get together and protest to the mayor or whatever about what's going on with the schools and that sort of thing, and end up causing all these problems. And so yeah, that I actually quite liked that they did that. They also have this thing where they don't mention race, right? I don't believe they do anyway. I'm pretty sure they don't mention race in any way. But I think that's kind of what's I guess conspicuous by its absence, as they say, to some degree, because although they don't mention it, they do have these things going on that seem like they're referencing sort of race relations and homophobia and various forms of discrimination without actually directly mentioning it. For one thing, you have the Hunters family, which is mostly black people, and then you have the vampires and their families, which is mostly white people, and then the two central characters that are in love with each other, one from the vampire family, one from the Hunter family, and so they're talking about, like, you can't be with this type of person, you can't be that person, it won't work, and this, that, and other. And it does kind of feel like there's this metaphorical reference to race without directly mentioning race. And I'd have to assume that's deliberate. I think it's very unlikely that a show like this would not be aware of that kind of metaphor in there. But yeah, it's still quite interesting as well, because like I say, they don't actually mention it, and race is never brought up as any reason for any kind of any part of the reasons why the two central characters can't be together. It's always about the vampire, the hunters. We're hunters, and we're trained to kill vampires, and we're vampires, and those are trained. That's the reason why it can't work, which of course is a pretty good reason, I think. You know what I mean? It's a pretty good reason. I mean, it sucks, as I get it. You love who you love. Sometimes you can't help who you fall in love with. Sometimes we fall in love with the wrong people. It's part of life, right? But yeah, if you're dating somebody who might have some kind of lapse and bite you and kill you, that could be an issue. And if it all in the other case, where somebody who's literally been trained to their whole life to kill vampires on reflex, it can be kind of an issue. So yeah. I won't get into how it ended, because I don't want to get into too many major spoilers. But I did like the way it ended, actually. I thought it was a really how they kind of resolve. Not really. I guess resolve not the right word, but how the show resolves, even though it. Actually, let me not say that. But how it ends. Let me just leave it there. How it ends. I thought it was quite a satisfying ending. Because without getting into too many spoilers, it didn't go along the typical lines of what sometimes things like this do. And I just felt like this was maybe a more believable way of how that would go by the end. And I don't know if season 2 has been announced or anything like that. It definitely ended in a way that looks like they're setting up for a season 2. And it also looks like season 2 might not even focus that much on the two central characters that were focused on this season, which could be interesting as well, because there's another character. In fact, another cool thing I liked about it is that every character has their own, kind of history and motivations, and it's not just the two central characters that matter. Even though you don't necessarily learn lots and lots and lots about each person, you do feel like you learn enough about most of them to understand that they're not just there to be there. Like, they have their own histories, they have their own stories, they have their own things that drive them, the things that are going on in their lives as well. And so it's not just, vampire girl, hunter girl going together and we're arguing about it and everything's about you know what I mean? It branches out, and it does so in a way that it still focuses on the two central characters, but lets you know that there is this whole world behind it. And if it does what it looks like it's going to be doing, assuming there is going to be season 2, then I think that could be a real interesting thing for a show to do, because it could mean that the focus shifts from these two central characters to another character, and then continues the story that way. Of course, that just waits to be seen. But yeah, they did do something which kind of stood out to me a little bit in regards to. I kind of said I said before, they didn't mention race relations and they kind of these metaphors. They didn't really mention homosexuality in a kind of a negative way, like nobody's really struggling because of it. Not entirely. There was, but because there is this one bit where one character who's somewhat struggling and having issues with his identity, and turns out he's a little bit spineless. And let me just leave that there. I realize how it sounds. But let me just leave that there. And if you watch the show, you know exactly what I mean. Yeah, it's they don't really bring these up in any kind of like way, in any kind of negative way that other shows might do, where characters are struggling with this and they may be getting bullied or teased and things like that. They're not really dealing with that, and I guess it's kind of supposed to be like this thing where the filmmakers, the showrunners, they're just going to be like, it's 2022. We're just going to assume the audience knows that, certain people deal with certain things. So rather than focusing on that side of it, we're just going to focus on, other aspects of it and barely mention it in that way. So yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting way of doing it. Perhaps that's something or a sign of how things going forward, because we've seen stories before about people struggling with their identity or struggling with acceptance, struggling with various things like that. And not to say that those stories don't have a place anymore. I think they still do, but maybe it's time to force something else, and perhaps this is the beginning of that. Just perhaps so yeah, that I thought that was quite interesting, where they just don't kind of mention it, or it's like referenced, I guess, metaphorically, but not really mentioned directly in any kind of real way like that. But yeah, I did like the show overall. There were some bits where especially towards the end, where it did feel a bit odd, like some of the directorial director, yeah, that word. Some of those choices just felt a bit odd. They just felt a bit weird, and they kind of stood out in some of the scenes where it kind of has this I don't, what's the word, not theme, aesthetic, or if you will, where throughout the whole series, and then there's a couple of scenes that just don't fit in with that, and it's just kind of weird. Why it's kind of an odd choice, because it doesn't, at least to my mind, and perhaps a smarter person could figure it out, but to my mind, it doesn't feel like there was any real point to just like changing how the scenes are shot and then going back to how it's all done. So it's literally just a few scenes that just shot in this weird way. It's kind of like, and it just kind of felt like it was going along this, relatively sort of serious kind of vibe, and then it gets to this point where it's still serious, but it felt more like, like a 90s soap opera for a few scenes, and then it goes back to this more sort of serious modern tone afterwards, like how it was before. So it's like this, or like serious kind of modern tone, and then it turns into a 90s soap opera, and it goes back to serious modern tone. And I just felt like I personally couldn't see why you would do that. It didn't seem to compute anything in my brain, but yeah, maybe somebody else knows what that was supposed to reference and why they did it that way. But to me, it did feel a bit odd. But I mean, it's a minor thing, it's not enough to ruin the show or anything like that. It just stood out to me. But yeah, I think all the characters in there were done well. You had like the more sort of stern characters. You had the people who were trying to do things a certain way, and then of course they get challenged in their own beliefs and their own perceptions of life when certain things start to happen. And you can see like a lot of range of how people deal with things. People on even the people on, say, the hunter side of range and how they deal with things, and people on the vampire side, and there's a range in how they deal with things. As far as things like the gore goes, I thought the violence was pretty cool for the most part. There was one scene though, again, it kind of stood out in a bad way to me, where it felt like a scene that excuse me, let me speak properly. It felt like a scene that should have been violent, gory, and everything, but it wasn't, because it just did it off camera, and it looked so odd. Like, the thing about off camera violence, I feel like there are ways you can do off camera violence, and you either don't really notice it or it still kind of fits it. I think Marvel do really well with their off-camera violence by the way it's sort of shot and edited, and you know what's going on without actually seeing what's going on. Tarantino, I think in Reservoir Dogs, there's a scene that actually happens off camera, but it's shot so well that even though you don't actually see it, you feel like you can see it. Whereas with this, it was so off, because it just looked, again, it's just the way it was shot. It looked really weird. It felt like this should have been either on camera gory violence, or they could have edited it or shot it in a way where it just didn't stand out so much as, at least I mean, I guess maybe there's another thing to that. Again, maybe it's one of these things I'm just too dumb to figure out why it's done that way, but to me it just looks like it looks like it stood out unnecessarily in a bad way, because like they've had some gore and some violence on camera, and then it comes to this bit and they do it off camera, which in and of itself is not the problem. It's just more the way it was done off camera, where it just looked odd and it had these weird close-ups that just it didn't do it for me. I felt like, you know what, on camera we'll do it different. But again, minor things. Overall, yeah, there's some pretty good gore in there for the horror fans. But yeah, I thought all the characters were done really well. So yeah, big up to the cast and crew of First Kill. And if they ever do a season 2, God willing, I'd be around to watch that. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll get bitten by a vampire before that happens and get turned into a zombie or a werewolf. Or I don't know, do I want to be a zombie, a vampire, or a werewolf? I don't know. I guess there's pros and cons to all of them. See, vampires, but I know some vampires can walk in the daylight, but if I get turned into a vampire, I don't think I could walk in the daylight. I think that was one of the rules. Well, actually, they don't really explain the rules that clearly. They do say things like the legacy vampires can walk in daylight, and I think if you get bitten by a legacy vampire, you can walk in the daylight. And I guess if a non-legacy vampire turns another person, they can't walk in the daylight. I mean, they don't really explain it in that detail. They only explain it up to a certain point. So yeah. But anyway, it made, I mean, I guess that they explained it enough to make sense for the show, but it didn't explain the full details of why. We understand why some vampires can walk in the daylight, but I guess we don't understand why others can't. And I'm just assuming it's because they're not all turned by the same types of vampires. But they don't really clarify that. And perhaps that's something that gets clarified in season 2, if indeed they make a season 2. But for now, I'm gonna have to think about if I want to be a vampire, zombie, or a werewolf. I'm thinking werewolf actually, because I feel like with werewolf, it happens once a month, right? And so for like once a month, you turn into a werewolf, you go in some madness, you just wake up somewhere in some woods naked. You have no idea what's going on. You have no memory of anything. Just like, how do I get here? I think I'd rather that, because at least you don't even know. And it's just once a month, you just wake up in some random place and just like, man, what's going on here? I have to figure out how to get home without getting spotted. You grab some leaves or something. But anyway, let me know what would rather be, a vampire, werewolf, or zombie. Let me know in the comments. And any other suggestions, recommendations, send them through and I'll see what I can do. Like, share, subscribe, because we're doing this thing, more videos on the screen. Check out my other channels as well, be much appreciated. But that's gonna be it for the minute. So guys, until whenever, if ever, peace.